Okay, so another major topic of discussion at this year's conference, loss and damage. So if this isn't an idea or a term you're familiar with, no worries, we got you covered. Okay, so loss and damage refers to costs already incurred from climate extremes like rising sea levels or climate-related disasters. Now, this funding would compensate costs that countries can't avoid or can't adapt to. But here's where it gets kind of complicated. You see, the Loss and Damage Fund would require countries that have contributed the most to climate change, aka the richer countries, to pay poorer countries to help them recover from climate-related disasters. And damage funding would pay for things like destroyed homes or bridges, things like that. But loss is a little more complicated. It refers to economic impacts like lost agricultural funds from things like sea level rise, floods, things like that. Now, research from a 2022 report found a group of vulnerable countries lost one-fifth of their nation's wealth because of climate change. So I talked to an expert about why this is something we're paying attention to now. Joining me now is Chloe Demrovsky, President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Eric.
So with disasters becoming more frequent and more severe because of climate change, what kinds of economic impacts are we likely to face in the future?
We're seeing a lot of them, and so they're finally starting to talk about them. So for so long at the big climate conferences, the conversation has been about mitigation, and they haven't really talked about adaptation and the impacts and dealing with the impacts because that's been considered climate moral hazard. If we focus on paying for or adapting to the damages caused, then there's going to be less done on the mitigation side. That all changed last year at COP26, and the conversation is sticking there with COP27 happening right now in Sharm el-Sheikh, with much more focus on adaptation and resilience, and also on this idea of loss and damage, because we are seeing impacts of climate change right now. They're being calculated and attributed to climate change now much more rapidly, especially after these sudden onset disasters like floods, for example, or hurricanes. They're able to say like, oh, this was made worse because of climate change impacts that we're seeing now. And so a lot of those big eye-popping, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollar numbers are being seen today. Those impacts are being seen right now, and that's expected to grow over the coming decades. So it's much harder to ignore this part of the conversation now than it used to be.
Yeah, so I guess you could say it's unfortunate it had to take that to get this kind of attention, but a promising sign, the evolution in the way we're looking at it. But, with most economic concerns, it always seems some cities, states, countries are impacted more than others. Is the same true here when we're talking about disasters?
Yes, especially when it comes to climate-caused disasters, the biggest emitters are not the ones seeing the biggest impacts. So the biggest impacts are being felt in countries that are historically very low contributors to emissions, some of the lowest contributors to emissions, developing markets, frontier markets, countries that have not contributed significantly, places like Somalia, that already have fewer resources to deal with this, to adapt, to change, and they're not the ones who created the emissions that led to the problem in the first place. Whereas an emitter like, China is on that list, but they're pretty far down. Russia's even farther down. And the U.S. doesn't even crack the top 100 in terms of those countries that are going to be most impacted by climate change. So the biggest emitters are not the ones feeling the frontline impacts today. I mean, the countries that are feeling it are places like Pakistan. You might remember that earlier this year during the monsoon season, Pakistan faced just overwhelming levels of flooding. I mean, a third of the country was underwater. That was tens of billions of dollars of damage in Pakistan, which is a country that does not have the funds to deal with their economic situation, much less with dealing with something like that. So they're coming out as a very strong voice in the negotiations right now and asking for more aid in this area. But of course, developed countries don't necessarily want to commit to paying loss and damage because there's a fear that will open them up to a legal liability that just will never end.
So with that disparity that we just talked about in mind, what can we reasonably expect to happen if world leaders fail to advance loss and damage funding?
Well, there has been some progress made, and the developed countries will tout that. So what we're seeing is that, there were commitments made for the developed countries to contribute funding, whether it's grants or loans or some combination, they have not been living up to those pledges, but there is more peer pressure to kind of live up to pledges that were made in the past. Asking for then loss and damage, which is a big theme here, is an even bigger ask. So if they haven't lived up to what they've been asked to do in the past and they've committed to do in the past, are they likely to commit to more? Probably not. But what we are seeing is that certainly the Biden administration is touting the Inflation Reduction Act and that action on climate change, which is the biggest thing that's happened over the past year, the biggest change since COP26. So that is certainly going to be a talking point, much more on the mitigation side, of course. And then John Kerry has talked about a proposal that's more about the carbon market. So trying to get money for carbon offsets that companies are so interested in purchasing to the developed markets, where a lot of developing markets, where a lot of these, say, forests are, and to try to make sure that the carbon offset market is functioning more effectively, and that money then goes to developing countries so that they can help. They can use that to deal with the issues that they're seeing. So there's going to be a lot of proposals sort of around the issue, but certainly the host country, Egypt, is very committed to pressing this issue. And the focus in general of this COP is on loss and damage. So we'll see what happens.
And Chloe, one last question for you, because climate change, a lot of people are concerned about it. They're passionate about it. They want to see things change, but it's a complicated issue. So I wanted to just end by asking you, what else does the average person not fully grasp about this that we need to talk about more?
Well, I think that what needs to happen more is the kind of education of it. A lot of this is very long term. So for individual consumers to make individual choices is very difficult to have an impact. But where it does have an impact is, letting your governments know or companies know that you're watching their behavior. And that's where changes are really going to come from. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a very long-term conversation. I think it's important not to get kind of tied up in the frenzy of it in the moment, but to focus long-term on the changes that we're seeing happen. Get educated about the technologies, how soon they might be viable for individual consumers, even with something like buying an electric car, right? It's not necessarily a viable strategy for a lot of people right now, but that's going to change, and that's going to change rapidly over the course of the next decade. So staying educated about, the changes that are coming will be very helpful, and over time, I think we'll start to see these new technologies really start to drive some change.
Yeah, so staying educated, keeping the conversation going. Chloe Demrovsky of the Disaster Recovery Institute International, thanks so much for coming on to do exactly that. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric.